Hey, Tori and Jeremy. First off, thank you very much for coming. And it would be great if you both introduced yourself briefly, starting with Jeremy.
Right, yeah, Jeremy Alder, Senior Product Designer on the UX Front-End Foundations team at GitLab. Been with GitLab about a year and a half, I believe, and focus more on the visual side of the product, accessibility, and more systems thinking as it relates to the UI in the product.
I'm Taurie. I've been at GitLab for a little over 4 years, work on the same team as Jeremy as the product design manager, focusing on the same things.
Super. So really excited to have you both on and wanted to discuss about how our value of iteration applies to design systems and also how design systems apply to iteration as well. So first off, I think I'll ask, how has iteration been used to shape Pyjamas, which is our design system?
Yeah, I can take this first, I suppose. So GitLab is huge on iteration, as we know, and it's kind of how we've developed such an expansive feature set of the entire DevOps lifecycle. So working on Pyjamas has really been no different. We've really iterated our way from where we are now, but we started with just a UI kit in Sketch. So that was just to ensure that designers had a consistent UI library to pull from. And we knew that a UI kit is not really a design system. There's a lot of other aspects to a design system. So from there, we started building out kind of more of a skeleton site to house all the different sections and areas of a design system. And we just added a bunch of to-do notes to add content in later. You can still see a lot of those there because we're still working on it. We didn't like push out an entire Pyjamas website with like fully built out components and all the documentation written or anything like that. We really just iterated towards having all of those different aspects. And that includes like other content such as like foundational design tokens or design principles and accessibility content. We have our VPAD in there. So it's really just been iteratively adding all of those different aspects over time. And we've also been updating them, like as new designers join, they have great ideas. The product grows, users have different problems that need to be solved. So it's really just a forever iterative process. Anything to add, Jeremy?
Sure, I would add that it's been iterative from our tooling standpoint, and it's shaped how we've worked. So for example, transitioning from Sketch to Figma, iterating more towards community engagement and open design. So we've also updated kind of our tool set around that. And I think one of the key things about the iterations is it happens often organically and not so much planned. And there is a lot of planning, but what I mean by that is that as we grew a great deal in the last year, we would have some things that were set in stone and documented, and then you'd have new designers come on and ask questions like, why is this way? What about this? Have you thought about this? And even though it might have been things that you've already kind of done the lap around once, you're going around a second time and looking at it from a different perspective. And so we're able to iterate with fresh eyes and fresh input, fresh reaction, fresh experience. So it's allowed us to iterate and kind of have like a strata of opinions and experience on certain things that's added a depth to it, to the conversation, and a history around every decision that's really helped, I think, iterate towards where we are today.
Cool. So it seems like a lot of the process or the content and the tooling have sort of developed iteratively and organic over time. And I wonder whether maybe you could expand on how the process has developed iteratively hand in hand with the content and so on.
Yeah, I think like when we were first starting, we were trying to figure out a way of creating a process that allowed designers and engineers to contribute in a way that was a little bit structured so they had something to follow. So we've really kind of iterated our way through creating like for example, issue templates that designers can follow to add new content to the design system. We've created like what we call the component lifecycle that has these 4 different stages. So, which is like, you know, we create the documentation for the component, we need to build the component in GitLab UI, we need to style it, and then we need to integrate it into the product. So kind of having these different processes that help other people contribute to the system and iterate on it over time.
Nice, nice. So we can flip that sort of question on its head that I originally asked and say, how can PJs, our design system, how can that actually help with iteration at GitLab?
Go ahead, Jeremy, you want to start?
Sure. I think that it can help just by being able to kick back new things into the product and to be a source of truth for those ideas and a place to point to. So it's not a dictatorship where some design systems are kind of like, this is the overruling, but it's something kind of undergirding our thinking, and it allows us to constantly point back to it and make sure that as GitLab grows and new features grow, we have something to leverage to iterate on and to build on. So it's kind of building a what do you call it? Not a gumdrop, but like a jawbreaker from the inside out, you know, rather than kind of dissolving in. We're kind of adding these layers and iterating based on that core thinking.
Yeah, and I also add that Pyjamas is meant to help increase operational efficiency. So by having kind of these comprehensive guidelines and reusable components and all of these standards, designers can work from the foundation that improves efficiency, which means that teams can iterate faster. So kind of having like efficiency and iteration go hand in hand, I think, in order to iterate quickly, it needs to be efficient, and Pyjamas helps facilitate that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose one way that I've approached iteration in the product is by using components almost like various stepping stones as you're adding more and more functionality. So the first iteration of a feature may just be like a text field, while the next iteration of a feature may be more enhanced with like a button and so on. And then you sort of using these components as like stepping stones to quickly add more and more things on until finally sort of a better configuration of features sort of UI components is sort of arrives. So yeah, it's been super useful to have a design system where you can sort of pluck bits and bobs and use those to facilitate iteration throughout the design process as well. Cool. So if I was like a new designer coming in and wanting to contribute to the design system, what might iteration look like for me as a new designer coming in and trying to contribute?
Yeah, I would say iteration looks similar to working on the product. I like to think about a design system really just in the same way as you would a product that users have. It's just maybe the users of the design system are the organization that you're working for. So that means the same thing that we would say for any other product, like boring solutions is big at GitLab, getting the smallest thing out there as soon as possible and then getting feedback and iterating on it from there. I mentioned this earlier, but like just adding a ton of to-dos for things that we'll get to later and next. And I also think it's important to point out that even though we work with an MVC mindset for the design system, what makes it into production needs to be accurate. So like we don't just merge in anything because like somebody opened a merge request. At least to the best of our ability, like no one is perfect, so not everything is going to be like super accurate and perfect from the first go. But since the design system is something that the entire team is using to build the product, We don't want to merge things in the spirit of iteration that we know are confusing or not helpful. So to do that, we want to start with small merge requests. So then we're adding, maybe it's accurate partial documentation to something, and then we can iterate on it from there. The whole idea is just to help others help solve user problems.
So maybe you could provide like an example of what that might look like.
You know, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was trying to think of an example before this call. I was having such a hard time. I know I come up with, or I encounter this often. I don't know if Jeremy, you have an example. The only example I could think of when I was thinking through this earlier was with our recent drag and drop documentation we were working on. We left out a bunch of content that we hadn't yet defined. So like, what should the animation look like? And I think that's okay. It's better than just as long as we say like, this is something that we're working on next, like we're gonna work on what this actually means, that's okay. But we don't wanna say like, use an animation to do this thing. We wanna say like, use this specific like animation type that we've defined and have like specific guidelines for that. It's not exactly what I was just touching on because it's not like something that's inaccurate. It's just the specificity of, however you say the word, of the specific guideline, but it's related. I don't know if Jeremy, you could think of a better example.
You know, my example might be a little different, but given the fact that we have the product, we have GitLab UI, we have Pyjamas, we have the component library, oftentimes we're iterating towards that single source of truth. And so Dropdowns, for example, are a component that we're working on in multiple ways. And so there's been, from a design standpoint, just iteration towards, there's a previous effort in Sketch to align these and change up the pattern to be more accessible and useful. And there's research around it. And then we transition to Figma, and then migrating that to Figma, and then to GitLab UI and in the product. And so there's kind of this iterative process that, you're just constantly working towards that end result. And, it's not always like a direct line to it, but we're always kind of moving in that direction. We're still on that path with that component in particular. But I don't know if that's a helpful example or not, but that's kind of one of the ways of how iteration might look like from a design standpoint, where you're kind of doing tooling in multiple places and constantly kind of evaluating where it's used, how it's used, who uses it, both from a design standpoint and a user ultimately as the consumer of it. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think iteration can take many sort of shapes and forms. So it doesn't seem to necessarily have to be like, here's a feature, here's a little bit more of a feature, here's a little bit more of a feature. It can also be things like levels of fidelity as well. So like you said with the to-dos, you could have first thing would be like a sentence and then a to-do, and then next thing would be maybe adding a chart, and then next thing would be maybe adding a couple of toggles or something to change how the chart looks or whatever it may be. So like there's different ways that you can approach iteration, whether it be fidelity or content or documentation, layout, structure. There's loads of different ways you can do it, and each one of them is valuable in some unique way, I think.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to like treating the design system as you would a product, because that means at that point you have to build out a roadmap for how you're going to get that content in there. So the same as you would build a roadmap for some feature set within GitLab, we need to do the same thing for the design system.
So what are some of the biggest challenges around having a design system that uses iteration so much?
I would say the biggest challenge is making sure that as you iterate, everything is iterating, right? So you can iterate in Pyjamas, but that's isolated to a degree from the product. And so if we're experiencing this now, you update something as simple as a hex value in the product in GitLab UI, if you don't change the way that GitLab thinks about that hex value, then not everything is going to be iterative. It's not going to catch up. And so it's making sure that as you're building the clock, all the gears are connected and kind of telling the right time, and I found that that's one, that's definitely one of the challenges. It's just making sure that iteration keeps momentum through, the entire life cycle of its like intended goal and use.
Cool. So one of the things that I was wondering about when I first joined GitLab is understanding that iteration was such a like widely used value. It was like really, really taken seriously in GitLab. I was just wondering, how do you manage like an ever-changing UI within the product in order to make sure that customers don't go crazy when a button's here one day and then there the next and then there the next? How do you actually manage the the user experience of iteration?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons why we started the design system. So there's at least some sort of guidance or guidelines around how to use each of these individual parts. So then even while the UI is ever iterating or ever changing, there's at least some semblance of usage guidelines that help designers know how to use which component and where to use it, and how to structure content, and all of those different aspects that come together to form the user experience. And that's not to say that the design system's like the say-all. There can definitely be, I think Jeremy touched on this earlier, there can definitely be like outliers or things that are done separately from the design system. There should just be reasons for those kind of changes or things that don't match what we have in the design system.
Yeah, I think that's good. And to add on that, we document everything. And so one of the things that I found that's helped is to actually document where those changes are headed, so that as a user encounters a change in the UI, or somebody, internally, so often is like, why did this happen? Did something just change here? Is this known? You have some documentation to point back to say, yes, this is known, and we realize, this is kind of the MVC for this, but this is where we're headed. That really helps a lot, because as a designer, when you have thought ahead in that way, you're more comfortable knowing some of the things that are going to trip up along the way. You understand that, hey, we're migrating buttons, and we're going to have two buttons next to each other that are potentially conflicting because one's been migrated, one's not. We're okay with that because we have this epic that says this is where we're headed and this is how we're iterating towards that. And so even from a user standpoint, we have the ability to direct them to issues and say, this is where we're going as a product. And I think it's very positive because it satisfies that initial reaction, but as a designer, it makes you more comfortable with iterating in that fashion because you have something to kind of fall back on and point to. It's not, you don't fall into a defensive mode of like, well, we made this change for this and this. You have something to kind of do that for you that shows some of that thinking. And so I think documentation is incredibly key, and it's been really helpful.
Cool. And with that said, what's the future direction for our design system, and how are we going to use iteration together?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we're working on right now in Q3 of this quarter is just migrating some components from Pyjamas into production, the GitLab production. So this quarter, it includes migrating 8 components. We have Vue and Haml components, so we want to get those utilizing what we have in our design system. Beyond that, we have, I mean, everyone in the UX department and engineering and product, really anyone can contribute to the design system. So ensuring that we have processes in place that help facilitate that is always going to be part of our direction, because the foundations team can't do this all on our own. We really look towards the people who are working directly with users to help guide us in what our direction should be. And then there's a bunch of other initiatives specifically that Jeremy's been working on. Maybe he can touch on them a bit, around like accessibility. He's been working on color palettes. I know you, Nick, have been working on data visualization. So ensuring all of these kind of things that are in progress get mapped out and are scheduled so that we can ensure that they're added to the design system over time as well.
Yeah, lots of things. So yeah, as Taurie mentioned, like color palettes, things that are kind of under the hood that are going to make the product better as some of the migration happens. So if it's color palettes for accessibility that, you know, the buttons leverage when they get migrated, if it's documentation, behavior, all that kind of stuff, you know, we're trying to come at it from multiple ways, both what you see visually, but also how it's built. And there's also a lot of research that's happening that goes and feeds into those items that you might never really see on the surface, but it's there as far as those changes go.
And we have a direction page too that maybe we can link in this description of this video so people can check it out and add to it if they have anything to add.
Good idea. I'll also link Pyjamas in there as well.
Cool.
So is there anything that you want to say or ask to leave everyone with today?
Help with our Q3 OKR by migrating components. Maybe we can link that OKR in this description too, in case, because community contributors can help too if they watch this video and they're like, oh, I want to, you know, contribute to an open source project. This could be the perfect opportunity to do that. And you're also helping us implement our design system.
Nice, nice. Jeremy?
I would just say like, yeah, no help is too small or not appreciated, right? It's all appreciated and it's all helpful. There's multiple, you know, in this cycle of iteration, there's multiple on-ramps. And so whether you're more development minded or more design minded or accessibility minded, or even just the UX of a certain thing, there's always going to be an on-road to it. It doesn't mean you have to take something from A to Z and see it through the whole way. There's just ways that you can micro contribute to in there that I would encourage everybody to do.
Yeah, even just like changing the text or fixing some spelling mistakes and stuff definitely would be well received. Super. So thank you very much, Jeremy and Taurie. Really great conversation, and I'll see you both later.
Yeah, thanks,
thank
Nick.
you.
Ciao. Bye-bye.